This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Mr. Ralph Goff, a 35-year-old veteran of the CIA, where he was a 6-time chief of station. He also previously served as chief of the CIA's National Resources Division and is now an expert commentator with the Cipher Brief. Ralph Goff joins us today for a discussion on Israel's Operation Rising Lion and broader activities in the intelligence realm within Iran. Stay with us as we speak with Ralph Goff. Ralph Goff, welcome to NatSec Matters.
Hi, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on today.
Well, you're going to be a fascinating guest because we're talking about one of the more interesting topics that have come up in the last years, I would say. And that is the way the Mossad has seemingly penetrated deep into Iran. Not just top officials, but military officers. And it would appear they have a whole network of agents inside of the country that not only surveil on behalf of the Iranians, but it appears actually carry out or direct drones to top officials' targets. Is that this sounds like an audacious topic and a lot of fun, and I think you're the guy to get into it. Does this sound good to you?
It does. It does. You're talking about some of my favorite people that I dealt with over the years, both in terms of the challenge of working with them, right, and in terms of what they can accomplish.
Well, before we get into these examples of assassins on motorcycles and an article I'm reading from the Jerusalem Post about Mossad sending female operatives deep into Iran, and before we get to, of course, Operation Rising Lion, can you talk a little bit about the counterintelligence environment inside of Iran? And, you know, without giving away any secrets, I've heard or have read that a tremendous amount of the population is non-Persian, and I wonder, does that make that a very interesting pool from which Israel and others can recruit?
You raise a couple of really salient points there. First, let's address the CI environment, as we would call it inside Iran, right? So Iran's essentially a police state, right? It's a theocracy run by a minority, right? An elite minority of the highly ranked religious Shia figures, right? But it's a police state. And, you know, they have several levers of control over their own population, right? Including, you know, from the street cops, the beat cops, the police, to the Basiji, which is kind of like a volunteer militia made up of religious and government fanatics, right? To the IRGC, which is essentially a second armed forces, if you will, that complements the traditional armed forces of the, you know, Iranian Navy, the Iranian Army, the Iranian Air Force. You have the Iranian Republican Guards, right? And it not only is it like a military force, it's kind of like a heavily armed criminal gang, right? Because they also engage in all sorts of economic activity, right? Which is how they keep their power in this police state. So, you know, it is what we would call in the business a traditional denied area, right? Which means that heavily policed, heavily controlled. You know, the internet is controlled by the central government, right? They've imported, in spite of embargoes and sanctions, which have crippled their economy, they still seem to find the money for surveillance cameras and surveillance technology, right? They have close working relationships with our adversaries and the adversaries of Israel, Russia, China, North Korea. Right, pick one of our adversary states, and you know you're naming an ally of Iran, right, and their services.
Well, this just makes it all the more enticing to hear about. If it's this high of a threat environment, how are the Israelis succeeding?
So, you know, like anything, police states have their weaknesses too. And, you hit one of the main ones is the diversity of their population, right? Something like 70% are not Persian, right? You've got a huge minority of Azeris in the Northwest, right? You've got a huge Arab minority population down in the South, right, down towards Iran. We always hear talk about the Iraqi Shia, right, who have close ties with Iran. Well, these are not ethnic Persians; these are ethnic Arabs. And so you've got Afghans along the border with Afghanistan. So you have all these different ethnic groups, and they have different takes on religion, right? Not everybody adheres 100% to the ruling form of fundamentalist Shia religion inside Islam, inside Iran. So anytime that you have divisions in your population, right, you have points that a talented intelligence service can exploit.
Yeah, right. I remember asking on a trip to Israel when I was working for the government of some CIA officers, essentially, what is behind the Israeli success? And I think the answer had something to do with they are in a tough neighborhood. Their threat environment is so much greater than ours. They're just higher risk takers too. And that seemed like a fair explanation.
It is. And Michael, the key to that, right, is the fact that for Israel, Iran was, at the moment, maybe not so much, but definitely prior to their recent conflict with Israel, Iran was an existential threat to Israel, right? Iran was never an existential threat to the United States, right? So, this meant that for Israel, their equations for how to deal with Iran greatly differed from the equations that the United States were making, right? For us, Iran was a nuisance in the region, right? With their proxies, they were a nuisance in places like Venezuela, right? A nuisance with the support that they provide to Russia in the terms of drones for Ukraine. But none of this adds up to an existential threat for the United States. Their missiles, their aspirations for nuclear weaponry, yes, that would put them on the radar of potential existential threat to us. But they always were for the last couple of decades, they've been an existential threat for Israel. So for the Israelis, that meant they were engaged in a struggle for survival, which means the rules are vastly different from the rules that we would follow.
Yeah, fascinating. So I began to get a better sense also of the Israeli risk tolerance, however many years ago it was, when the Israelis found out where the warehouse was on the outskirts of Tehran, where all of the nuclear weaponization documents were stored. And it wasn't just that they figured it out, because I might have just assumed it was done remotely, if you will.
Yeah.
But they went in there, took all of the documents and computers and whatever else, put it on an airplane and flew it back to Israel. And I was just kind of stunned that not only do they have people there that, I guess I assumed they would come in and out all the time, but not only are there people there in safe houses, presumably, but they had an airstrip and the ability to spearhead out of Iran a bunch of highly, let's call them classified papers that were near and dear to the Iranian regime.
Yes. Look, you're talking about the nuclear archive of Iran, which was, stored sort of in an industrial park on the outskirts of Tehran. And the Israelis managed to, over the course of a long weekend, right, to steal the whole thing. I've seen the archive in one of my visits with our colleagues there in Israel, so it's real. And this is the kind of operation that they excel at. And the reason why they're able to do things like that, again, is because they're looking at the risk equation of, the Iran nuclear program is a direct existential threat to Israel. Therefore, our risk tolerance will be much higher. Now, the other thing the Israelis are very good at is, it's not like the Apple TV series Tehran, right, where you have the Israeli Mossad agents running around the streets in Tehran, right? Although I'm sure they're capable of doing that when needed. But what they're really good at is recruiting other people to do the dirty work for them, right? They're very good at recruiting from amongst these disaffected ethnic groups or religious groups within Iran or in the region and using them inside Iran. And in this operation, I don't know the full details of it. Didn't bother asking, right? It was enough just to see this stuff. But in this case, so I do know it was a lethal operation because, these documents were guarded. So there were, guards at the facility who had to be removed, right? So this was a lethal operation, which meant that it required the approval from the highest levels of the Israeli government, which tells you that they viewed this operation as essential to the survival of Israel, right?
Yeah,
so much different from then like a CIA operation says, well, we're really curious about the nuclear program in Iran. Let's try and steal documents, right? We would have a much higher, I would say, a much higher bar to reach in terms of determining if the operation warranted the kind of risk we would face. For the Israelis, they really didn't have that problem. They, nuclear program, existential threat, let's do an operation.
Amazing. If you could just outline, and I'll get into some more examples here shortly, but what are the big sorts of structural building blocks of a successful operation inside of another country? Is it safe houses and covert communications and agents on the ground? And by agents, I don't mean, as you correctly pointed out, not Mossad agents, or not Mossad officers, but agents that they've recruited. Like, what are the other big picture things you really need to take care of?
So, yeah, Michael, look, one of the great things I love about intelligence work in reality is that unlike in television where, everything is dramatic and exciting. No, a lot of the work is really, frankly, boring, dull bureaucracy, not just getting approvals, but, for an operation like this, you're talking about logistics, you're talking about moving money, right? These guys aren't doing this stuff for free, right? And you can't exactly pay them. The Israelis can't pay them in shekels or send them a check from the Israeli central bank, right? So you got to figure out if you're going to recruit people, how are you going to pay them? Logistics and transportation, right? Are you going to be on the hook for resettling them after the operation when perhaps their cover will be blown because of the nature of the operation, right? So what are the longer term requirements for an operation like this? So there's a lot of in-depth planning that has to go on here that would be done far from the action, right? And of course, one of the key ones would be communications, right? Which, I love how American TV, Hollywood, and to some extent Israeli TV, they've solved the problem of communications by pretending it doesn't exist. Like, you see these agents, they run into a building and they're communicating with their headquarters, right? But they're not wearing a radio. Maybe they have a little thing in their ear, but there's no microphone, there's no antenna. And yet, they go inside a building, and if the plot calls for it, their communications work inside the building. Whereas in reality, that's pretty hard to do sometimes, depending on, the nature of the building. So, communications cover for these people, right? There's all this stuff that has to be done well in advance of the operation itself. And the Israelis, frankly, they're amongst the best in planning this stuff, right? And also, you've got to look at this where an operation inside another country, you can't have the footprint of a foreign government. You can't have the fingerprints of your government on the operation. So the Israelis are looking at all sorts of commercial means, most likely, of hiding their operation, right? Using commercial fronts or businesses or office fronts in other countries, right? Whether it's very famously, they've been caught when they did an assassination operation in Qatar a few years back, where they used a number of passports from European countries, right? Which did not please those countries when they were revealed, right? So they're using a lot of international cover. They're using commercial facilities. And again, this is all stuff, you can't just set this up overnight. It takes time. So a huge logistical effort behind the operation.
And money, because I imagine even if you've got an ideological predisposition against the regime, you're not going to take, or these groups aren't going to take enormous risks unless they're paid for it.
That's right. Right. And look, these groups, like I said earlier, you can't just pay them in shekels, and you can't just write them a check, right? From the U.S. Treasury or the Treasury of the Central Bank of Israel, right? You've got to pay them. Maybe you're paying them in some sort of cryptocurrency, right? In which case you've got to hide your tracks there. Or maybe they want gold, or maybe they want some sort of things that they can barter in their local markets, right? And on top of that, these other groups, a lot of the times, you know, they're doing this for the money, but for another purpose. If you're dealing with, like, let's say, a team of Arab Iranians or a team of Azeri Iranians, right? Perhaps they have their own group and they're working for the Israelis. You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but at the same time, they're looking to maybe fund their movement, right? Like, say, the Southern Azerbaijan People's Liberation Front, right? They're looking for funding. Like, well, let's work with the Israelis and let's, cash in on a big payday doing operations for them so that we can fund our own revolution, right? So there's a number of options there.
All right, fascinating. All right, well, let's get into Operation Rising Lion. Talk a little bit about first of all, what was your reaction as a 35-year veteran of the CIA as you saw these operations roll out? Everything from the apparent assassinations of senior officials down through the means by which Israel was, I guess, sending quadcopters and other, in addition to missiles, into military weaponization sites.
So, I think the first point to make would be that Operation Rising Lion did not take place in some sort of vacuum, right? This was another step in a chain of events going back, to, frankly, years of warfare between Iranian proxies and the state of Israel, right? The Iranians were very successful in the last couple of decades of building this network of proxies throughout the Middle East. I mean, Iran shares no border with Israel, right? Yeah, if they want to fight the Israelis, they've got to go toe-to-toe with them. So they built this ring of willing proxies, right? Like Lebanese Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, the Shia militias inside Iraq, right? They've got networks inside Jordan, fairly benign country. They've got, they were running Syria essentially for decades, right? So they were the Houthis in Yemen, way down in the south, right? So they built this ring of containment and engagement, if you will, around Israel. And so the Israelis, after the Gaza uprising, which is, that's an entire podcast in itself. The Israelis took these threats on one at a time. And I have to say, like, I was astounded at how they dealt with each one of their foes one by one and knock them off. The idea that they would knock out all their proxies in a relatively short period was just jaw-dropping, right? And so that made Operation Rising Lion, it didn't make it like something predetermined, but it definitely made it much more possible, right? The other aspect of Operation Rising Lion is that it didn't occur in a political vacuum, right? So there are a lot of political considerations that went into this that frankly rest not only on the foreign policy goals of Israel, but their internal politics, right? You're looking at an Israel that has never been more politically divided than it is today. And, that plays a huge role in the decision-making process that resulted in Operation Rising Lion, right? The attack on Iran. I think we had a precursor to that when there was a small tit-for-tat exchange between Iran and Israel, in which Israel came out way in the lead. And I was surprised that Iran didn't take the hint, right? It was after when the Israelis conducted a strike, a very accurate targeted strike on an Iranian consulate facility up in, I believe that was in Damascus, right? Where they took some senior IRGC officials, right? And the Iranians had no choice but to respond and launch an attack on Israel, although they really didn't want to, but the hardliners like, we can't just sit this one out, right? And, they launched drones and missiles and all against Israel. And essentially, I think one person in Israel was killed and the entire attack fizzled out. And then meanwhile, the Israelis struck back and in a very calculated and limited way where they literally removed the air defense capabilities of Iran and kind of sent a signal to Iran as like, okay, we're going to let this one go for now, but we've just sent you a signal that your airspace belongs to us. So, attack us at your own peril from here on out. So it was, Operation Rising Lion was kind of like a decision that was made that, okay, we've opened the airspace. The Iranians have still shown that their hostile intent. We're not happy with where they're heading with their potential nuclear weapons program. And they made the political calculus, and I think, which was heavily, heavily influenced by the internal politics of Israel, to launch the operation.
Yeah, fascinating. Talk a little bit about the role of assassination in the opening hours of Operation Rising Lion. There was definitely nuclear scientists and top military officials, but, analyze it for us. And, how did that appear to you?
First of all, nothing new for the Israelis. All right. When it comes to targeted assassinations, the Israeli intelligence community and military community have a long record of that. And in fact, if your listeners are interested in that, there's a really great book, Rise Up and Kill First by Ronan Bergman, right? A very accomplished journalist, that essentially spells out the history of lethal operations from the Israelis. So, striking your enemy, rise up and kill first is a biblical saying. The Israelis are fond of that stuff. Reaching out and taking out the commanders and the command structure of Iran is, one can almost say mundanely that it's part of their SOP, right? It's just that how they managed to do it by, from what I read from open source stuff, was they essentially spoofed these guys with communications and had them, some of them gather in places kind of Israel's choosing where they could bomb them and take them out, kind of like, hey guys, let's all meet at the secret bunker, right? And then boom, took them out, which shows an incredible depth of intelligence knowledge on their targets, right? The find, fix, finish loop, right? The hardest part is the find, right? And second hardest is fixing it. The finish part, it can be relatively easy, particularly for a country like Israel, which is so skilled at carrying out strikes of this nature, right? But the find and fix can be difficult. In this case, the Israelis managed to do it with incredible skill and accuracy. So this is something they're really good at.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Ralph Goff.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
We'll talk a little bit about the different methods by which they would have tried to target these individuals for intelligence collection purposes. I'm sure it's a mix, but is it electronic principally? Is it human? Is it what's your sense of what's necessary to have pulled that off?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a multiple choice quiz. The answer is C, all of the above, right? So it's a combination of the ints. And for instance, in the days when I worked in, right, it's called the fusion of intelligence. You're fusing SIGINT, you're fusing it with human, you're fusing it with imagery right? So the Israelis are pulling all that stuff together and fusing it, and coming up with a target, right? And so for them, particularly, in the opening stages of war, the first thing that your adversaries will do is get off comms, right? If in Baghdad in the old days, we used to joke like, what do you call it? Terrorist with a cell phone in his pocket, right? Dead. So
yeah.
The IRGC command and all that, these guys aren't reckless. They're very, the Israelis have been after them for years. And so they've developed some pretty good strategies for their self-protection. But in this case, Israeli intelligence overcame that, right? They were able to track these guys, whether their phones were on or off. And my guess is they had some pretty good human sources that could say, these are the locations where they go, right? They probably had, now this is conjecture on my part, but 'cause I wasn't actually down. I wish I could have been down in the control bunker to track this up. It would have been fascinating. But, you can do cyber operations where you can steal the standard operation procedures, right? The SOPs. You steal those, which spell out, okay, here's how we respond to, an attack. Phase 1, we do this. Phase 2, we do that. So if you have an understanding of your enemy's standard operating procedures, and then you have on the ground people who can tell you, like, okay, this is where the bunker is. This is where the secondary bunker is, right? Then you can put together a targeting package and work on that. And then in many cases, in a war zone, your commanders, they know they shouldn't have their communications devices with them, but, for a variety of reasons, they're very often likely to have them on, right? Because communications is the first thing that tends to fail in an emergency. So if they had backup systems, the Israelis probably had knowledge of and access to those, or in many cases, their primary systems. These guys, we're taking a big risk, but probably needed to maintain command and control. So you add all that up, and the Israelis, were able to exploit that.
And I also read that in many cases, and this is also from before Rising Lion, the 12-Day War, but that Israel is tracking the security officers around these top officials who didn't turn their phones off. So that's another vulnerability.
Exactly.
All right. Well, how interesting. I want to talk about the future in a minute and what the U.S. intelligence community is doing to monitor the nuclear facilities. But I came across an article from the Jerusalem Post that says dozens of Mossad women penetrated Iran during a 12-day war. And this is marked from September 14th, and it says an exclusive. And what the article goes on to say is that boots on the ground, executing missions critical to the strikes. It says that these women were more than spies. They were field operatives capable of surveillance, sabotage, and kinetic strikes. They targeted high-ranking kinetic officials. And we see this in movies. We see this around books, but it seems to suggest that they were in a position to seduce some of the senior Iranian officials to help them gain intelligence. I wonder if this sounds right to you. Does it surprise you, or give me your steer on this?
So when I dealt with the Israelis, I used to always tell my subordinates I had only 2 rules in dealing with the Israelis. First is, don't ever take it personal, right? They're tough to deal with. And 2, never be surprised, right? And the never be surprised is based on 2 things. One is the Israelis are very predictable, right? If they have 3 options, right, they will always choose the option that is in their best interest, right? So never be surprised on that, and never be surprised at just how creative they can be, right? And this comes from decades of having to be creative and decades of having to consistently develop new tricks to defeat their foes, right? You can't the days of portraying their adversaries, be they Persians, be they Arabs, be they Islamic extremists, the days of portraying them as inept, right, are gone, right? You have to be tricky to get at them, and so you have to use every trick in the book. And in this case, if it meant that they sent, I would question the dozens of women. No, but some women, sure, right? And actually, in any service I've ever been in, the services that treat their women as equals generally have increased their odds of success, right? I look at countries where they treat their women with scorn or as second-class citizens, whether it's the Taliban or the FSB or Chinese services, right? All these other, there's a consistent pattern amongst our adversaries there. Female officers have an advantage, and in many cases, and in a place like Iran for 2 reasons. One is because, in male-dominated societies like Iran, who look down on their females, right? They underestimate them. They don't see them coming.
Yeah.
And second, there's a particularly with Persian males, right? you have the ones that look down on women, then you have the other ones that treat their women with incredible respect, right? Their mothers, their sisters, right? They're very respectful of women, and to the point where a female case officer can get a Persian agent to do just about anything they want, and without sexual, right, favors. I mean, the key to espionage is getting past that, and sure, it plays well in the Hollywood version of women are seducing these men, and maybe in some cases there was some seduction going on, but I doubt if it was any of the Mossad female officers. They may have recruited prostitutes or required other women to do it for them. But I would seriously question the idea that female officers were doing that, because they don't need to. They've got other tools that are much more effective than sex. And frankly, sex gets in the way. All right, they want these guys to do what they need. Then you've got to overcome that. And the best female officers I ever worked with were really good at that.
So not just with reference to Israel, but let's address this Hollywood thing for a second. Movies and honeypots and all these things. Is this something that's used widely across the world, or that's just Hollywood boilerplate? It's
more common in Hollywood than in reality. Right? Okay. There's just too much baggage there.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems a bit risky. Oh, before we go to sort of where we are in the future, I wanted to also talk to you about the pager operation. This, I think, would be in a different category. Maybe if we were, trying to classify everything for an academic article. This is a supply chain operation, very difficult to pull off, seemingly took years, if you believe all the articles. Tell me what you thought of the pager operation, and give us a sense just how difficult was this to pull off?
So it's difficult for several. Well, first of all, technical challenges, right? You're going to create a pager, right? That's going to be lethal or semi-lethal, right? And still function as a pager. So you've got to conquer the technical aspect of creating a device that doesn't look like a pager with a bomb built into it, right? Then, the supply chain itself, and here's where the genius of the Israelis are. They didn't just penetrate or interdict the supply chain. They created their own. And so that shows that they spent time and money and effort in, understanding not just the customer, right? In this case, the RGC and the Iranian leadership, the customer for buying pagers, right? Or rather Hezbollah for buying pagers, but, the sellers, right? The producers, right? They had to set up a supply chain because, again, like I said, the Persians, and the other adversaries of Israel, these guys aren't buffoons, right? And they do their due diligence. They don't just buy stuff, right? They're looking at the supply chain. And if they see something fishy, whether it's like, hey, wait a minute, this company that supplied these chips, there's something fishy about this company, right? Or this company that provided the transmitting equipment for the device. There's something questionable there, right? You've got to have it all in place, and it's all got to withstand scrutiny, right? So that takes time, money, effort, and patience, right? Because this is an operation that's set up, years in advance, and officers who are setting this up, right? You have to have, I think, a system in place that recognizes that it's going to take time. Whereas, here in the West and, the U.S. government, we're not renowned for our patience, right? It's always what did you do this year? What did you do? What are you going to do next month? Or what did you do this quarter, right? With the Israelis, though, this showed, extreme patience in understanding the supply chain, recreating the supply chain, building in place, the ability to withstand scrutiny, conquering the technical challenge, and then ensuring that it got, delivered.
So this is, reminiscent of the point you made a little while ago, that intelligence work is not just midnight raids and drone strikes. It is painstaking, takes years, and you really need a patient service and a patient officer corps to go through this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was I used to joke that, the one fantasy show that I used to envy the most was that old show 24, right, where everything happened in real time in 24 hours. Because I used to joke, I said, look, in reality, the first 6 episodes would be, Jack Bauer sitting outside the travel office trying to get his travel voucher approved so that he could go somewhere.
Yeah, that's funny. Yep. So, just to go back on Iran, we talked about the police state. We talked about several levels of surveillance and repression, from the police to the besieged to IRGC and traditional armed forces. Yet the Israelis were able to run circles seemingly around all of this. So what are the repercussions? I mean, they're not going to do a 9/11 commission report like we would, or a commission of inquiry like they are going to do one day in Israel. What are the repercussions inside of Iran? I mean, you must just have so little confidence in who you're talking to. You must begin to suspect everyone. And I've read about purges or massive arrests, but I don't know if that's for show or they really figured it out.
Yeah. No, look, as I said, police states, right, they have a lot of vulnerabilities. And I think one of their main ones is that when things go awry, the finger pointing, the infighting, the backstabbing, the betrayals increase. They don't decrease, right? This, in a police state like that, mistakes can be fatal. So, and in the follow-on can be fatal when they, when heads of security are held accountable and taken out and executed, right? So, same thing in Iran. I mean, the Israelis, I think, knew full well that by embarrassing the security service, one needs to look no further than the operation in which they killed Ismail Haniyeh, right, who was the Hamas negotiator who was killed in an IRGC safe house inside Tehran, right? And I remember when that happened, I remember asking one of my Israeli friends, I'm a little bit mystified by that one because Haniyeh is the kind of guy that you negotiate with, right? Why would you kill a guy that you need for your negotiations, particularly when you want your hostages back? And I said, oh yeah, this had nothing to do with Hamas. This was all about Iran. This is all about taking up the confidence of the security services there and pitting them against each other, right? Because when there's a failure, the IRGC is going to point at the Ministry of Intelligence, the MOIS, right? They're going to point and say, well, it's those guys' fault. And meanwhile, the MOIS is going to be pointing right back at them. No, this is your fault. You're safe house. So, the recriminations, and then also when stuff like that happens, right, then the spotlight of doubt and the spotlight of question falls on the leadership. And next thing you know, everyone's questioning, like, okay, just how loyal is this person? Was someone paid off here in the senior leadership? I mean, this was a secure facility that isn't well known. Who sold us out here, right? So it's kind of like throwing a pebble into the pond and watching the ripples. The ripples gather strength. They don't just, in a society like Iran's like that, they don't just dissipate. In many cases, they gather strength, and the repercussions become more serious as time goes by.
Yeah, and I bet the Israelis are doing a good job of exploiting or sowing doubt inside of Iran about who they can trust and who they can't.
That's the time when you turn on your information operations and start feeding in the narrative, a pre-prepared narrative, right, to sow doubt and confusion on your foes.
So, obviously, intelligence played a decisive role in the targeting of the actual nuclear sites across Iran. Many are known because of commercial imagery and the IAEA, but there are a lot of places, and we've talked to David Albright and others who study this open source-wise for a living,
Sure.
And there were many sites that the Israelis knew about that had not sort of surfaced in the open source. And so this is just one of the clearest examples, I think, of, intelligence in the service of a national aim. And I also would love to hear what you think going forward. Is the Israelis sort of, used up all of their resources inside of Iran? Is it going to be twice as hard in the future to figure out nuclear sites? What's your take on that?
This is a good one. That's a great question. I was looking at that one earlier and thinking to myself, yeah, okay, what are the lessons learned here, right? And both sides are going to learn lessons, all right? And so both sides are going to have to adjust. The Iranians, once they get past the first stage of panic, the second stage of recriminations, right now they're in that third stage where, okay, where do we go from here? How do we tighten things up? And, the Israelis will have to respond accordingly. And but the Israelis, again, they're thinking forward. And I'm sure, my friends in the Mossad, before the bombs were even falling on targets in Iran, they were already thinking, okay, where do we go with our future operations here, right? In terms of asset networks. And, I'll give the Israelis a lot of credit that they're very good at rebuilding networks. One of the areas, though, where they differ from us, or they have a much more cold-blooded view to their networks, right? I've known over the years where I've witnessed them lose a number of networks in other countries of agents, right? And then rebuild them. And, the individual case officers, because they're human, of course, they'll feel some remorse and they'll feel some sadness. But, as an institution, it's kind of like, this is the cost of doing business, right?
Yeah, right.
And they just get on with it. So, before they even used up these networks, they were building new ones. And I'm willing to bet they have capabilities still in place. And Israel and the Iranians are certainly aware of that and are certain to be trying to find them themselves, right? So what that means for the Israelis is they've got to adjust their tradecraft, right? In many cases, you can develop a method of tradecraft and you can use it once and then you got to throw it away. And where services fail is where they say, well, this worked last time. Let's do it. Let's use it again.
Yeah. Right. And we've had some horrific tradecraft errors when we tried to use, let's call it COVCOM in one theater, and it's discovered and it's being used all over the place. Ralph, as we begin to wrap up, I want to get your views on Ukraine. I know you traveled there a lot when you were a CIA officer, but I know you've also been as a private citizen as well. This sort of echoes what we said about Israel. If you're facing an existential threat, a nation, an intelligence service is willing to do many extraordinary things that they wouldn't ordinarily do in peacetime. I wonder if you might just comment a little bit about how you see the war going and what role does intelligence play in the war with Russia?
Look, very timely question, particularly today in the press, shortly before signing on here with you were articles in the press about the Trump administration saying that they're going to allow sharing of intelligence so that in support of deep strikes by Ukraine into Russia, right? So something that is clearly changing in the Trump administration in regards to their calculus on Ukraine and Russia. So, I'll preface this by saying that when the war started, the U.S. intelligence community got 100% correct the fact that Russia was going to attack, right? We saw this interesting spectacle where you had former Director Burns engage in what we call intelligence diplomacy, where he traveled, right, to a number of countries in Europe, and he went to Ukraine and he met with President Zelensky and he said, hey, look, the Russians are coming, all right? They're going to attack you. We have the intelligence. And they shared all this stuff, and it was brilliant. Although, President Zelensky didn't want to believe it, and he refused to believe it until Russian missiles were impacting on Ukrainian soil back in February 2022, right? But what doesn't get as much attention is the fact that the United States intelligence community absolutely blew it on two key questions. One was the U.S. intelligence community completely overestimated the ability of and capabilities of the Russian army, right? This whole bit with, they're going to take Ukraine in 3 days. They're going to take Kiev in 3 days. They're just going to steamroll over the poor Ukrainians, right? And then they also completely blew it on the capabilities of the armed forces of Ukraine to defend themselves. Had they bothered to ask people who actually knew the Ukrainians, people like myself who have said, hey, the Ukrainians aren't going to give up in 3 days.
Yeah, right.
And the Russian army, and this is a great example of over-reliance on technical information as opposed to human information, right? If the U.S. intelligence community had all this reporting from Russia, right? Various sources from liaison, from all this stuff, and it was, stolen reports or hacked reports or cyber. It was all about how great the Russian military was. It was all lies, right? Our analysts were analyzing lies. What we lacked was that good human source from the Russian army who could have said, look, I'm a general. I command a division. I haven't written an honest report on the state of my unit in my entire career. Right? And where the difference that this made was, at least this is now my conjecture, had the intelligence community been able to brief the Biden administration, say, look, the Russian army is a paper tiger, which is what Trump called them the other day, right? President Trump referred to Russia as a paper tiger. Well, I don't think they're so paper now. They have their problems, but back then they certainly were. And had we gotten that call right, and had we said, look, the Ukrainians are going to fight them tooth and nail for every inch of their country, right? It might have changed the calculus to where instead of closing our embassy before a single shot had been fired and refusing to send in weaponry because we didn't want to lose it, right? I mean, already you can't win a war if you're planning for defeat. And the failure of the intelligence community to get those two questions correctly meant that the administration did not plan to win, right? And so, unfortunately, a terrific opportunity to maybe nip this thing in the bud was lost, and we find ourselves where we are today. So,
wow, that's really important. I mean, that's not just, the IC missed the call, but it may have had a material impact on the way the Biden administration chose to supply and resource the Ukrainians. That's amazing. One other thing on this is just sort of an aside. It drives me crazy when I hear that our own intelligence community doesn't interview people within their own building like you who would know. Or there must have been hundreds of NATO officials that had amazing insights, not only into the Ukrainian army, but probably the Russian army as well. I'm always thinking about, some of these generals we see on TV a lot, like General Ben Hodges. But what is up with that? Is that just a cultural bias toward classified secrets, and they're not looking at what we have around the U.S. government?
I think it's partially that. I think it is a bias towards clandestine information. And yet, we always espouse, human is the golden human, but it's the human of last resort. You have to expend all your other resources first to make sure you can answer a question without, having to turn to human. But in so many cases, it seems like we don't really follow that ourselves. And, in the case of Russia, I think it's a hard target. Russians are hard to recruit, right? Hard to run as agents. It's hard to penetrate the inner circle. And not only that, but it's Vladimir Putin, you essentially got to, not just penetrate his inner circle, but somehow you got to get inside his head, right? Like even in my case, I'm an old Russia guy, and I remember shortly before the invasion, when I was posted in the Middle East, and my ambassador came to me and he's like, "Hey, Ralph, you're a Russia guy. What's going on here?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Putin's going to attack, but I think he's only going to attack in the south. He's going to throw his chips into the south to seize a land bridge to Crimea. Then he's going to dig in and hold it and fait accompli for the west." And my ambassador astutely asked, "Well, what about all these troops that are up in the north?" And I said, "Well, those troops are there to kind of threaten an invasion, a general invasion, and they're there to cause the Ukrainians to pin down forces in the north so that the battle in the south will be easier." But then, a couple days before the invasion, Vladimir Putin went on TV and gave this impassioned speech, and I remember watching that. And when I listened to him and his twisted view of history and his twisted view of how he's been wronged by NATO and the West, and his denigration of Ukrainian culture and the anger and emotion in his face, I quickly texted my ambassador and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Ambassador, but I effed up here. This guy's going all in."
Wow. Yeah.
And he did.
He sure did. Ralph Goff, thank you so much for joining NatSec Matters.
My pleasure, Mike. It's a pleasure to be a part of your podcast. I follow it, and you've got great guests and great conversations, and I'm honored that you included me in the list.
Well, thank you. We'll definitely have you back. These issues are really important and have direct impact on the geopolitical horizon. So thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
That was Ralph Goff. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.